Okay, welcome to our discussion of human evil. And it's when bad things happen, not only to good people, but to you and to me and other good people. So I do have a PowerPoint, but what I would want to do from time to time it will be to just kind of break out the PowerPoint and engage in a discussion. Okay, so question or comment? No?
Yeah.
I want to, before we get into this, and you were
Yes.
talking about the evil that is going on and everything, how would you define evil?
We're going to get into that.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
I mean,
Yes.
really?
Yes. So actually, the first two sessions are going to be both evil and tragedy, but that's actually the first question. So thank you, Judy.
Yeah, lead in.
Yeah, let me move this over a little bit. Okay. So this question is so important that there's a whole branch of theology named after it, and that branch is called theodicy, addressing the question of how is it that a good, loving, just, powerful, and all-knowing God could allow bad things to happen to good people. As I mentioned, the discussion falls into two separate issues: the problem of human evil and the problem of natural tragedy. But even before we dive into this, I want to point out, if there's no God, there's no problem. If there's no God, since we're being recorded, I'll try and watch my language. Crap happens and stuff happens, and there's no point in looking for, deep theological, deep philosophical reasons. It just happens, particularly with natural tragedy. This becomes a difficulty only if at the same time you're trying to include God in the discussion.
Well,
Because
Michael, doesn't it matter what your concept of the God is?
Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Larry.
Yes, I would say it very much matters, but no matter what your concept of God is, this is a question you're going to have, I think.
Because if one believes in a God that created the world and then turned it over to us and said, okay, you now have free will.
Yeah, so that will be a lot of the discussion tonight. But then again, what about natural tragedy? And Erwin, you had your hand up.
Yes, I would like to know that the mitzvah and the commandments are both set up at between man and God and man and man. How come evil is not set up evil against God and evil against man?
Okay, so we're going to actually get into the question of what we mean by evil, because there will be evil against God and evil against man. So, Bryce.
So how come we're tied to the idea that God is like all-powerful and all-knowing? I mean,
Okay, I'm not tied to that idea, but theodicy raises this question. I would say any concept of God, well, so here's my assertion. Any concept of God raises this question. And maybe it doesn't bother you, it bothers most people I know. And at least it bothered all of you, or interested all of you enough to be here this evening.
Yes.
When you say this bothers, what you're referring to with this?
The issue of horrible things happening and people often raising the question, why did God allow this to happen to me, my loved one, my family, my wife, my child, the world, global warming, coronavirus, Hitler, Auschwitz? That's a question we rabbis hear a lot. And so that's the subject. Okay, so the question is, first question is, what's good and what's evil? Who gets to decide? And is it the same thing as what is legal and illegal? And we'll talk about this for a second, but I just want to point out that what Hitler did was legal according to the laws of Nazi Germany.
Right.
Slavery was legal in this country. And when President Obama was born, the marriage of his parents was illegal in 19 states. So I think what I'm going to do is stop sharing so we can see each other, because I want to ask your definition of what's good and what's bad or evil. Anybody want to chime in?
I think the word
Jay?
bad and evil are different.
Sorry, Jay. Are you?
This is all very interesting. I would say that a couple weeks ago, I had a huge argument with a family member who is Jewish, but I don't know to this day whether they believe in God or not. Because the question given to me was, how could God do this virus?
Right. Okay.
And
That's
if he
going to be
did
the
do this,
subject.
God-
That's specifically the subject for next Wednesday.
Well, then let's take it one step
Can you wait a
further,
week?
Rabbi. How could God let these looters go into these stores in New York and do the things that they
Okay,
did
so
there?
that's a subject for tonight. Presumably, you're asserting what the looters are doing is wrong. I'll just call it evil. Evil may have a bad connotation, but it's wrong, right? Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So how do we decide what's right and what's wrong?
Well, we have laws.
Well, that's what I was just saying before. The laws of Nazi Germany allowed Hitler to murder Jews. He obeyed those laws. Does that mean what he did was okay? Slavery was legal in this country. Does that mean it was okay?
Right.
Well, it depends. To me, a blatant violation of the moral code I believe in is evil.
Okay, the moral code you believe in. What about the moral code Hitler believes in? Why is his better than yours? Or yours better than his, sorry.
That is an argument that can be made. Okay?
Yes, and I will make it.
But that doesn't contribute to the healing of the world.
Okay, I would assert that pursuing
thought
this
he was healing
argument
the world?
can, but somebody else, Suzanne, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I've been thinking lately, we've been talking about the 10 Commandments in terms of Shavuot, and I've been thinking lately that instead of saying you shall not covet, it should have said you shall treat everybody, Hillel's statement, do not do unto others what you don't want others to do to you. I think that should have been the commandment, not do not covet. But,
Okay, well, there is that commandment. There's 613 of them.
I know, but if you're talking about the first 10, which is what most people only get.
You could call them the Big 10.
The Big 10, okay.
They're not the first 10.
Okay,
And
the
in
Big
Jewish
10.
tradition, they're not even called the 10 Commandments. They're
Okay.
called the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances.
Okay.
And the one about not coveting is, in some ways, the most interesting because it's the only one that deals with thought crime, as Orwell would call it, rather than actions.
Right.
And one of my teachers says that it's not a commandment at all, it's a prediction. That if you obey all these other rules, then you will not covet. Because as you'll hear me say over and over again, Hebrew is ambiguous, and the grammar of the 10 Commandments is either future tense, just simply you will not murder, meaning a prediction of what you're going to do, or a command form, you will not murder.
Whoa.
So that's kind of an interesting ambiguity in the Hebrew. Also ambiguous as to whether it's male or female, which is interesting. But it's singular. It's addressed to us individually. Any other thoughts?
Well, I think that the evil, first of all, I don't believe in the concept itself of evil, but I believe that we label things to be evil when they result in the destruction of the society that we live in, B, that they perform what we consider to be an injustice. And I realize that customs change and what's considered to be injustice changed. So
Okay,
it
so
really depends on the rules of the society.
Okay, so from the rules of Nazi Germany, they were trying to preserve the culture, and I don't remember your second.
Well, I understand, but what I would assert is that what they wanted to do was incompatible with our system, and that's why the two systems went to war.
Right. So do you think one system was objectively good or bad, or it's just two different systems and ours happened to win?
No, I think that it is not just the preservation of the culture, but also the preservation of the individual dignity of human beings. And it has to be a combination of both.
I absolutely agree with you. I would just observe that the Nazis wouldn't consider Jews human beings or fully human beings.
Well, so, then according to that set of rules, then everything's okay.
Right. I would say no, and here's why. So this is an argument which is one of the reasons I decided to become religious. It's not an argument for the existence of God. For me, it's an argument for the necessity of living as though there is a God. So there is a book which I admire a great deal. It's called "When the Nine Questions People Ask About Judaism" by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin. And I'm going to quote from a couple of books. What he asserts is, what they assert is, if there is no God, there are no rights and wrongs that transcend personal preference. The laws of physics are not good or evil. Without God, all we can have are opinions about morality, but our opinions about good and evil are no more valid and binding than our opinions about good or bad ice cream. As the famous atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell conceded, I cannot see how to refute the arguments for the subjectivity of ethical values, which is what I was just referencing, but I find myself incapable of believing that all is wrong, that all that is wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. So the issue that they raise is, and it doesn't solve the problem, because there are different religions and different views of God, and probably if you interviewed, Hitler, he would say, yes, God wants me to kill the Jews and so on. So it doesn't solve all the problems, but what they are asserting, and which I believe, is there are things that are inherently good and inherently evil, no matter what an individual culture or society says. So that's where I would say the religious perspective on this begins. It's actually a very good discussion in the book, and so just to carry it one step further, people would argue that you should do what's rational and reasonable, and they point out reason does not protect from immoral behavior. In fact, it often suggests it. In fact, we have a special word that we've created to defend wrong things using the laws of reason, and it's called rationalization. The Nazis behaved reasonably when they obeyed orders to murder and so furthered their careers. One can argue that the only people in Nazi-occupied Europe that acted against reason were those who protected Jews. They had literally nothing to gain, and they potentially could and did risk their lives. Erwin.
There are many examples in the Torah that God demands, and the God even supports genocide, to kill everybody on the other camp. Now, is that good or evil?
So I would say that is the reason I don't take Torah literally. We get into the discussion
But
that
God
I've had.
wrote the Torah.
Hold on a second. So here we go again. This is my two doors discussion, two rooms discussion, for those of you who have heard it before. Here's what I think about that. I'm going to actually stop sharing and talk about this. I think this is a really, somebody waiting in the waiting room. Whoa. Okay. Let's see. I don't recognize this. Oh, TA. Okay. Nope. Great. So here is the discussion. I think it's a very important question and a very important concept. And the concept is, whoa, I just screwed this up. The concept is, there are things in the Bible, Torah and also other parts of the Bible, where God appears to order things which I think all of us would agree are evil. And I'll just use one example. God commands King Saul to wipe out all the Amalekites, men, women, and children. And in fact, Saul loses his kingship because I think he lets the king survive. We would all agree that that's evil. Okay, now you've got to decide which of the following rooms you want to live in. Okay, I'm going to show you all 2 different rooms. In room number 1, we all agree the Bible is literally the Word of God, and God wrote the words in it. And we inherently believe in that. Okay, that's room number 1.
I choose 2.
I'm sorry? You choose 2. Okay. You haven't heard about door number 3. Ivana, would you show us? So in door number 2, I would say, here's what I'm defining door number 2. We understand Torah and Bible as the fundamental foundational document for our religion. And also we would concede Christianity. And at the heart of Islam also, although that's a more complicated discussion. But we understand that while this may be the inspired word of God as we understand it, people wrote it down and it's not inerrant and there are things in it that are wrong and we should critically analyze it. That's door number 2. Going back to door number 1, God told Saul to kill all the Amalekites. Door number 1, I believe it. I agree with it. And God had God's reasons for it, and I'm not sure what they are. And if authoritatively God tells somebody in biblical times to do something, we're going to agree and we're going to do it. Okay? That's in door number 1. In door number 2, in room number 2, I would say there was a war between the Jews and the Amalekites, and what I read in the book of Samuel is a record of that war, of people trying to justify what happened, and I don't take it literally at all, okay? So far, everybody in room number 1 is happy, and everybody in room number 2 is happy. The problem arises when people in room number 2 start calling the people in room number 1 names, okay? And vice versa. So if you're in room number 2, stay there and study Torah and study Bible and understand it as not being literal. If you're in room number 1, you are going to have reasonable questions about how this Bible got written and why God would do this thing. And I would say, you know, ask your Chabad rabbi, ask a rabbi, or study the text. Study the text. The second one. Study the texts that help you understand that. Okay, everybody with me on that? It's a very important question. I'm going to go back to and anybody else have anything they want to add at this point? I'm going to go back to the discussion.
Well, if you go through the Bible,
yeah,
there are a lot of things that God did, supposedly did, that really don't fit today.
Okay, are you in room number 1 or room number 2?
No, I'm in the kitchen.
No, I'm serious. I'm serious. Do you take the Bible?
I'm half and half.
I can't be there. That's against the rules.
Then I got to go to room number 2.
Okay, so in room number 2, I would understand it as historical artifacts. It's the way the authors of the Bible try to understand the early history of our people. And we shouldn't take it literally. And so if there's things in there that don't make sense, I would say, I personally am not overly worried about it. If I'm in door number 1, then I have to explain it. But if I'm in room number 2, I don't have to explain it. I might want to study it. I might want to understand it. I might be interested in the guys in room number 1 and how they understand it. But that's my take on that. Okay, I would like to move on. Just on the same issue, according to the New York Times, about 1 in 3 hotel guests steal something from his or her room. Now, I would venture to say that every one of those guests would agree that stealing is wrong, but they rationalize their behavior by saying everybody takes these souvenirs, hotels overcharge, it's built into the price, and so on and so on. That's rationalization. Reason alone can, I would say, help you prevent bad behavior, but it can't necessarily demand good behavior. Okay, somebody else is joining.
Which explains what's going on in these riots right now.
Would I explain, or are you saying which explains?
Which explains that.
Yes, I would say
yeah.
That's the subject of this whole evening, and
Right.
and I think this is going to get into it even more deeply. Two key insights from Judaism. Insight number one is people are neither all good nor all evil. That's not true in other religious traditions. So, for example, Christianity talks about original sin and discusses the idea, I'm going to talk, I think, a little bit more about that we're born into a sinful nature. So the question is, and we've talked about this, both men's Torah study and once, I think, maybe a week ago or so in my office hours, we can ask the question, which is really a scientific question, what forces shape humanity? So as I was putting this slide together, and you may come up with other ones, first is evolutionary forces. And by evolutionary forces, I mean Darwin. I mean, survival of species, survival of the fittest. Tribal membership, if you think about tribal days, there were forces that meant you were kind of comfortable with your home tribe. And then if you were attacked by another tribe, or you're just, you're taking a walk and you go into someone else's territory, there could be problems. Built into our DNA is xenophobia, fear of the other. Along with that, I would say there are social forces. There is peer pressure. When you get caught up in a crowd, when, when people want to, are hanging out with their friends and somebody suggests doing something really, really stupid. Boy, I could tell you stories of my kids, and I bet you could too. And they get caught up with it. Peer pressure, groupthink. Influence of authority is another big issue, which I'm going to dwell on a little bit. I'm going to mute somebody who's making a little feedback. Judaism understands this as ascribing to humanity's, it should be an apostrophe S, two inclinations. So Judaism understands and speaks of two inclinations. The Yetzer Tov, which I would say is the inclination to good, morality, and altruism, and the Yetzer Hara, which is an inclination to evil. Sometimes Ra is defined as evil, but it's more nuanced than that. Selfishness, self-gratification. I think it's what Freud would call the id. Any other ideas on this? You may have other things to add or question what I'm saying on this one.
I think the social forces is so much about what is going on today.
Well, but I would guess that social forces.
I know you're going to talk about it, but it's just hitting me right in the face.
Yes, so you're agreeing, but I would say it's not only today. I would think social forces affected us 1,000 years ago.
Oh yeah, yeah.
More so.
So I think
More so.
Yeah.
Okay, and again, I take this idea back to creation. I've used this thought in other places. Let's see, I'm hearing little chimes. I actually believe that evolution can be understood as God's tool for creation. In the book of Genesis, God says, say it at the Hadam B'Tzelmenu Kidmutenu, let us make God, humanity in our image. The traditional Jewish understanding to that is God doesn't usually say, we and us and so on when speaking of God's self. So it's really only in connection with these verses that it's used this way. The traditional Jewish understanding is God was talking to the angels, whatever that means. The traditional Christian understanding of this is God was talking to his triune self, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I like a modern interpretation that God was talking to the animals, which had been made before this. And you can even say all of creation. So like the animals, we have animal natures. And like God, assuming we take the idea of God seriously, we have a divine nature. And that's what the rabbis mean, I would say, in the idea of Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. Judaism understands these two inclinations to be at war with each other. Humanity is not all good, to which my side comment is duh. But on the other hand, humanity is not all evil. And certainly in our tradition, we don't ascribe to this idea of original sin. So actually in the morning liturgy, which is a prayer that's also actually to be said upon arising, we say, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. My God, the soul you have given me is pure. And actually some scholars believe this entered our liturgy as a very subtle way of arguing with original sin. But when Jews were writing the Talmud, we couldn't be obvious in arguing with Christianity. One of my favorite stories, and some of you may have heard me tell it, is there's a story about the rabbis being able to capture the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And by the way, in the Talmud, the Yetzer Hara is often understood as sexual desire, inappropriate. Well, not only inappropriate, but appropriate sexual desire. So there's a story about the rabbis capturing this, I'm sure is either Talmud or Midrash, the Yetzer Hara, and trapping it in a cage. And then as a result, the urge to acquire disappeared. Nobody went to work. Nobody did their job. Even the sexual urges disappeared. And in the story, even the hen stopped laying eggs. And I'm not going to get into the biology of this. The rabbis begged God to weaken the Yetzer Hara. And I think about this, something we think about a lot, which is a vaccine, kind of a weakened virus. God, could you just tone down the Yetzer Hara a little bit? But God said, no, either take it or leave it. And so they released it. And so we humans have both the inclination to do good things and selfless and altruistic. And we also have very much an urge to self-gratification. And it's very powerful. People do astoundingly stupid things when presumably they would know better. And I always submit as exhibit number one, our president, not that one, Bill Clinton, and Monica Lewinsky. I mean, he could have known this was probably not a good idea, but the numbers are just endless. But the drives, the sexual urges, and and drinking and drugs and all kinds of things are very very difficult to resist. So I actually think Judaism has this exactly right, that we have an inclination to good and an inclination to evil. I'm just going to wave hello to my nephew, Kyle, who just turned into his car. Okay. Okay.
Hi, Michael.
Hello. Okay. So we're going to move along. The other big issue, other than the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara in Judaism, the inclination to good and the inclination to sort of greediness, is free will. And we get to choose what side we're on in this war between our inclinations. We have the ability to do good and we have the ability to do evil. And apparently God doesn't intervene, which is another big theological issue. I believe this is the central lesson of the Garden of Eden. It's an interesting question to ask, what would happen if they hadn't eaten the fruit? And did God want them to eat the fruit? Maybe we'll pause there for a second. So what do you think would happen if Adam and Chava didn't eat the fruit, the forbidden fruit? And do you think God wanted them to eat the fruit?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes to the second, I presume, Suzanne?
Yes to the second. Yeah, when you tell a child, don't do that, and these people were emotionally children.
Okay, so then why? Why would God tell? So I often, when I discuss this, I often say, Deborah, I'm going to mute you. I often say it's like a parent talking to their, children. They're 14 and 12, and they say, "I trust you. You're good kids. Mom and I are going out for dinner. We'll be gone for 2 hours. There's a Netflix. You have popcorn. We really trust you." And just as you're leaving, you say, "Oh, by the way, don't look in mom's upper left-hand drawer." Bye. So the question is, how long until they look in mom's upper left-hand drawer?
When the car drives away.
Yes. And the second question is, would you want to have children who would not look?
No.
You're
not going to have much of a story with the Torah unless you have eating of the fruit of knowledge and of sexual reproduction and creation. So you need it to be there to have the rest of the book.
Oh, that's an interesting question.
I'm not going to make a good career unless I profit off of people abusing alcohol and all these vices and doing stupid things. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in business. So I know it's going to continue.
So I'll just point out that particular story about eating the forbidden fruit is not in the Quran. So, and probably not in Hindu script. I don't know what the Hindus do with this. But so here's my question. If we all agree that God really wanted them to eat the fruit, and it makes a good story, I agree with that. Why did God want them to do that? Erwin, you have your hand up.
That is my question. Why did God tell them not to eat the fruit?
I'm sorry, I asked it first.
But I put my hand up first.
Okay, yes, you did.
Okay,
Yeah.
so,
Bryce?
yeah, so, it's a nice metaphor, okay?
A metaphor for what?
Well, there's a battle within human beings, and I think the battle really comes about because we need to live in groups. We must live in groups. We can't survive alone, okay? When we have an immediate interest in something, but we also, as we grow up and as we learn the rules, understand that if everyone just goes and takes what they want, then nothing works.
Okay, how does the Garden of Eden story contribute to that?
Well, the metaphor is that this inclination toward toward evil, the whole idea that now knowledge of good and evil, I mean, it's a good story, but I mean, just to answer the question simply, if they don't do it, then they're not people. They're just other animals.
Okay, I absolutely agree with that. So what I would say is God wanted them to eat the fruit because I would say the story is a metaphor. I have a class on this about becoming human or leaving the animal kingdom. And I would also say it is to teach us that we have free will. You can't have free will in theory. You actually have to practice it. When I first started reading about this is one of the books by both Harold Kushner and Larry Kushner discussed this. It gave me great peace with my teenage children to realize they had to demonstrate their free will. You can't have free will in theory. You have to have it. You actually have to activate it and demonstrate it. Mm-hmm. And so if I agree with you, if they hadn't eaten the fruit, they would have remained in the animal kingdom, or they would have remained as naked babies. It's kind of an interesting speculation which one they would be. So,
Michael, I have a question.
I'm sorry?
Go
ahead.
Is it really free will if God knew that Adam and Eve were going to eat the forbidden fruit?
Okay,
of course he knew. He did that.
Okay, so that's a whole other question. Is God omniscient?
Yeah.
You're answering that question, or you're agreeing that it's another question?
Well, isn't that what the Torah says, that he's omniscient?
No, I would say no. And
Oh.
the proof text on that, which I don't have on the screen, is in Genesis 6:6, just before the flood. It says God regretted having made humankind.
Mhm.
And it pained God's heart seeing how humankind turned out. So if God were omniscient, then God would have known that. So I would say the Torah doesn't have a position on this. The idea that God is omniscient enters Judaism about 1,000 years ago in Spain with the Jewish philosophers, and they're heavily influenced by Muslim philosophy. But one of the points is, which really relates to this though, is from the Mishnah, the heart of the Talmud, which says everything is in the hands of heaven except Yirat HaShamayim. And I understand Yirah as being 2/3 awe and 1/3 fear. So at least this Mishnah asserts that God controls everything except people and people's relationship with God. Even more puzzling is in the Pirkei Avot, which is also part of the Mishnah. It says, all is foreseen by God, yet free will is given. So this one's a little hard to wrestle with, but the idea here is God really gives us free will, but God knows in advance what our free will decision will be. And Bryce, you're shaking your head in
Because if it actually is free will, it is unknowable. Because if it's knowable, then it isn't free. It is
okay. So I'll give you the traditional response to that, and the only one I think it's a puzzle, as Yul Brenner would say, it's a puzzlement. But the idea is God exists outside of time. We have free will, but because God's independent of the time system, God knows what choice we actually wound up making. And the example I use,
then it's not a choice.
I'm not going to solve your problem. I guarantee that. I foresee that with my infinite omniscience. But another way of understanding this is God has already seen the movie. And some of you have heard me use this example. You know, you're watching the movie with Jason and his chainsaw and his hockey mask, and he's hiding behind door number 3. And the sweet young thing is wandering into the house, and she's wondering, gee, what's behind all these doors? And she is going up to door number 3. And you are yelling at the TV screen, don't do it, don't do it. Yet you've seen the movie 3 times before, and you know exactly what she's going to do. But in the movie, she has free will. But of course, since the movie, the movie's already in the can, and so her free will choice is fixed. But I agree with you that it doesn't completely solve the problem. But that's our answer.
It's a fixed free will choice.
I'm sorry?
It's a fixed free will choice.
It's a fixed free will choice. No, the choice is really free will, but God knew in advance what the choice would be. It's sort of like the example I just gave you. You leave, you tell the kids not to look in mom's upper left-hand drawer. Do they have free will to decide whether or not to look in mom's upper left-hand drawer? Yes. But I know with perfect certainty what their choice will be. If I'm a human with that level of certainty, how much more so does God know? And that's basically it. I didn't, this isn't entirely simple or rational. So because of free will, I'm sorry?
It's like he has this completely figured out. Even though it's our choice, he knows all the different types of decisions that we make as humans.
Well, not only that, with this one way of understanding this quote from the Mishnah is it just doesn't make sense and we can't figure it out. A way of understanding it is the one I just suggested. It isn't necessarily the only way, and it clearly won't please everybody. But I really want, but I think,
alternative.
I'm sorry?
There's another alternative.
Which is?
That God is not omniscient, that this actually is an experiment, and God doesn't know how it's going to come out.
Yes, I agree with that. And that was, I think, the lesson from Genesis 6:6,
Mhm.
And the Torah and all these texts don't necessarily agree. A major important point about Judaism is typically the texts, whether we're talking about the Bible, the Talmud, and so on, aren't always going to be theologically consistent, and they don't care. What they care about is what you do.
Mhm.
So we can have different beliefs about God's omniscience. We can talk about it for 4 hours. When it comes time to eat, if we're going to eat together and we're traditional Jews, we have to have one set of rules about what's kosher. So God doesn't care what you think about omniscience, about the afterlife, about all these issues. According to Judaism, what Judaism really focuses on is what's kosher, what's not kosher. How do I hang a mezuzah? What am I supposed to do for my fellow person? These are the mitzvot. And there's a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity in theology in Judaism. But the rabbis struggle and strain and largely succeed and agree on what constitutes Jewish law. This is a point that's incredibly confusing for most of us. And the reason it's so confusing for most of us is because it's so different from Christianity. Christianity's focus is on what you're supposed to believe, much more so than what you're supposed to do. And because most of us have an image of religion that's really more influenced by Christianity than it is by Judaism. So we rabbis, this rabbi, will often get the question, where was God at Auschwitz? And so if we truly have free will, I would assert that that's the wrong question. The much more relevant question is, where was humanity at Auschwitz?
Michael?
Yes.
Gabby and David can't get back in. Can you let them back in?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah,
Sorry.
that's the problem.
You're making a good point.
Yes. Okay, yeah, it's hard to keep an eye on everything. Okay, so some important lessons from the Nazis. Were the Nazis somehow aberrations of humanity? Were they especially evil? Just noting, Germany in this era was the height of civilization, arts, sciences, and culture. All the guards at concentration camps were volunteers. We should say that was probably particularly good duty during World War II. The alternative might be to go, fight on the Russian front.
Yeah.
And so the question then is, how might we react under similar circumstances? What if we were guards at concentration camps? Is it possible that we would do the same thing? Erwin?
Kabbalistically speaking, when God gives us our soul from the soul supermarket above, all the souls are good. So my question is, why did he give the Yetzer Hara so we have to constantly fight against evil?
I would say if we had no Yetzer Hara, it would still be Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with no sexual urge, eating every fruit except one.
I think there would be no urge to do anything.
Hold on. When you arrive to a mature age, politically speaking correctly, mature age, and your hormones don't work anymore, then you should not, you usually don't commit any crime?
No, I didn't say that. The Yetzer Hara is the urge towards selfishness. So I would say God created us in the image, in both the divine image and an animal image. And the Kabbalists would say we have an animal soul and a divine soul. Cheryl?
Years ago in the 1970s, the psychologist Phil Zimbardo did studies on could you convince people to give other people electric shocks?
Yes.
And it turns out it works very well.
What a coincidence.
Oh,
it's Milgram, right? You were talking about Milgram, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, to me, this is a very important lesson. Thank you for introducing it.
You're
And thank
very
you-
welcome.
And thank you for sending me these slides so quickly so I could
Oh, of
do it
course.
well. So here's the experiment that Cheryl is talking about. It was in the 60s in New Haven, Connecticut.
I participated.
3 people in the experiment, a authority figure, and a learner and a teacher. The experiment was explained. The learner is strapped into a chair and their hand was held on a plate, and they were told if they fail to answer a question correctly, they will get a shock. And the teacher, supposedly the learner and the teacher, the names were drawn out of a hat, so it was random. The teacher also, their hand was held on, so the teacher had a sense of what the shock was like. In reality, this guy, the teacher, was the subject of the experiment, and this guy, the learner, was not actually getting shocks. He was in on it, okay? So the participants had to teach the learner word pairs: sun, moon, dog, cat, flea, collar, so on. And then the teacher would repeat those word pairs. The learner had to repeat it back. If they made a mistake, they got a shock for every wrong answer. So then the question is, as Cheryl indicated, the question is, how far would an ordinary New Haven citizen go in shocking another person simply because they are told this is an experiment and this is what you're supposed to do? And I actually have some data on this. All the participants administered shock up to 300 volts. After 300 volts, the learner, who is not actually getting shocks, would be banging on the wall and asking them to stop. But the experimenter told the participant to continue using verbal prods. I don't think one of the responses were, I can't breathe, but you can see where I'm going with this. 14 out of 40 participants left after 300 volts. 65% continued giving shocks up to 450 volts even after the learner went quiet. So they're giving this guy shocks. The learner, after a while, at one point, I think in some of the experiments, the learner said, I have a heart condition. I can't keep doing this. This professor kept saying, you have no choice. And the person would be quiet. Can you imagine somebody continuing to torture someone even when the person is quiet? It's almost inconceivable, isn't it? God, I can't remember. There's something I'm thinking of, but it's on the tip of my CNN feed.
New Haven
The
have a
participants
higher
showed
percentage
signs of
prison camp
nervousness or
guards?
sweating. If you Google this, the Milgram experiment, you can actually see they're not videos, they're film of this taking place. And then afterwards, they were told that there were really no shocks. So the interesting thing is, this is what the panel looked like that the teacher was seeing. So slight shock, moderate shock, very strong, intense, extremely intense, dangerous, severe shock, and XXX. Remember, 65% of the people would go up to this level. Here's the percentages. The people that would go up to the slight shock, very strong shock, intense to extremely intense, 435 to 450 volts, they thought they were giving to a silent participant something like 65%. There's some really interesting breakdown on this data. The original setup, this is a graph of how many people would go to 450 volts. In the original setup, that I just described, it was 65%. If instead of a university setting, it was an office building, only 48%. If the teacher and the learner were in the same room, if the person could see the guy getting shocked or pretending he was getting shocked, only 40% of the people went up to the highest level. If the teachers had to force and hold the learner's hand on the shock plate, 30%. If the guy in the white coat, the experimenter, leaves and gives orders by phone, 23%. If the experimenter leaves and an ordinary person gives orders without the uniform, 20%. If the teacher sees two other teachers, like they're in the room, say, no, 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 I'm out of here fairly early on in the experiment, then 90% of the people would not go that far. And if the teacher chooses the shock level, virtually no one goes this far. The experiment really was the influence of authority. The key question that they were addressing here is, how far would someone go, an ordinary New Haven resident, go in torturing a fellow ordinary New Haven resident simply because somebody in a white coat is telling him to do so, and this is the way the experiment should work. And I think when Milgram had this idea, he thought maybe 5% would go this high. And he was very criticized. And I think there was some real risk to his career, because we're not the only ones that are jumping to this conclusion, which is that we have within us, you could call it our Yetzer Hara, the respect for authority, in us to do the same kind of thing that the Nazis did. There's another one, Cheryl, you're familiar also with the Stanford prison experiment. Similar kind of thing with similar kind of results. Just don't have enough time to go into it all. So, big surprise, I was almost tempted to add duh onto this slide as well. I believe religion is the answer. I believe it's not a perfect answer, but I believe it's the best answer. And reminiscent of Churchill's quote, that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. But most people will assert, what about the question or the idea that most wars and evil is conducted in the name of religion? The answer is that it's simply not true. And we'll take a closer look. We often hear this claim that the worst horrors, worst wars were fought in the name of religion. There are a lot of wars that weren't fought in the name of religion. 66 million died in World War II. Communism has resulted in the death of some 100 million people. Stalin alone, 20 million. Communist China, 65 million. By contrast, the Inquisition, which is often pointed to as a classic, and it is, example of evil done in the name of religion, in its 400 years, killed about 5,000 people, or about half a day at Auschwitz. There is an amazing book, you would not believe that such a book would even exist, called The Great Big Book, and it's big. Let me show it to you. Here is The Great Big Book of Horrible Things, and it's not small. What is it? 650 some pages. It describes each of the 100 worst atrocities in terms of numbers of death in human history. Let me just finish the page and I'll call on you, Bryce. The Crusades, which is clearly religious, ranked number 30 in the list with about 3 million killed, or about less than 1% of the number of deaths in the preceding 29. And I went through this again. There's actually an appendix of different causes for the atrocities, and they have religion as one. And the religious deaths were about 19%. Religion was a factor in about 19% of the deaths considered in the book. In another presentation of data in a different way, Encyclopedia of Wars, that one I don't have, but you know what to get me for Hanukkah, surveyed about 1,180 conflicts and found that less than 10% involved religion at all.
Michael, did you say you said the crusade was 3 million deaths, and you said that was
the Crusades was 3 million, yes.
3 million, but didn't you also say that Crusades was equal to half the amount of deaths of one day of Auschwitz?
No, that was the Inquisition.
Oh, the Inquisition. Okay, yes. Got it.
Okay, Bryce.
Oh, in a sense, some of this abdicating one's own morality for authority is happening right now in fundamentalist Christianity. Okay, because the ministers are going to their flocks and saying that that President Trump is doing God's work. And
Yep. I absolutely agree with you. And I have, some further thoughts on that exact subject. And that's why I say it's not perfect. The question is there anything that's better? Positive elements of religion. Religion goes beyond prohibiting the bad and demands the good. So we have commandments like, don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. Most civil laws, Western law, requires you not to do bad things. Religious law requires you to do good things, like help someone in need, feed someone, and so on. Religion also asserts the idea that everyone is created in the image of God, independent of race, color, sexual preference, or, insert whatever minority you want. That when you treat someone horribly, you're treating God horribly. And this shows up in some statistics. Religiously affiliated households donate a lot more to charity. In some studies using a more expansive definition of religious giving have estimated that faith motivates as much as 75% of all charity in the United States. So there is another amazing book. Kyle, I'm going to mute you because some noise is coming through. There's an amazing book. Actually, everything Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes is amazing. He has Torah commentary. He was the former chief rabbi of Great Britain. And this book is called Not in God's Name, Confronting Religious Violence. And I was struggling with how to summarize some of his material, and I gave up. So I'm just offering a few quotes from the book. Within groups, we practice altruism. Between them, we practice aggression. Religion enters the equation only because it is the most powerful force ever devised for the creation and maintenance of large-scale groups by solving the problem of trust between strangers. Now remember, the kind of groups you have in sort of pre-religious times are very small. You may be nervous around Christians, but there's a couple of billion of them. And, I feel comfortable when I'm around Jews because I feel like I'm in the presence of Jews, and I feel like I'm in family. And I have to tell you, given my own interest in interfaith work, I feel comfortable around religious people in general. One thing which is fascinating, Will Durant once estimated that there have only been 29 years since history began in which there were no wars. Wars seem to be a constant. One of the goals of religion is to try and eliminate war.
Do you think that's a true statement?
I trust Jonathan Sacks and I trust Will Durant.
No, I'm not talking about Sacks. I'm talking about Will Durant.
Yes, he actually describes those years, and they're pretty recent. War is a constant. I talked at length in some of these classes. I lose track. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. This also is very powerful, in my opinion. I read a book which described 3 constants of human existence. And the notable thing is that in our time, we are resisting those constants. Let's see, I'm going to admit one more person.
War?
Okay, war is one. Except for 29 years, I never knew the number before, but except for those 29 years, apparently we were always at war, and everybody always understood that we're always at war. And if peace breaks out, it's a temporary existence while we're planning for the next war. We're rearming, we're building the Maginot Line, we're doing something like that. That's one. Second one is plague. Everybody always understood that sooner or later, and really sooner, some kind of horrible disease would break out and kill one hell of a lot of people. And everybody understood that that was just going to happen, and there really isn't anything you can do about it. The third constant is famine. You have a beetle infestation, you have a drought or something, and very, very large numbers of people are going to starve to death. That's the way it always has been. That's the way it's going to be. It's only really in the last 100 years or so that we are asserting that this is not the way it should be. You know, in spite of the fact that our religious texts might teach this, nobody ever really believed that it was possible. So, you know, COVID breaks out, Ebola breaks out. Instead of just saying, well, you know, what can you do? This happens from time to time. We're going to have to learn to live with it. We, you know, start putting on masks, and we start working on vaccines, and we start developing it. Wars break out. Just, you know, except for 29 years, we've always had war. But there is certainly a feeling and a sense that this is not the way things should be. We shouldn't be living with interminable war. And famine breaks out. And we try and develop, you know, insect-resistant crops and so on. So let me go back to the screen.
Michael, so this was, just to clarify, so this was an author that was saying these were 3 constants, but this wasn't the Talmud that's saying these should be the 3 constants.
No. It's just an observation. And one of the things,
an observation.
To me, it's a response to the idea that things have always been bad and they'll always will be bad. We have a deep-seated sense that this is not the way it should be. I found this quote fascinating and a great summary of the Jewish idea of a chosen people. I just think it's brilliant. A chosen people is the opposite of a master race. First, because it's not a race, but a covenant. We are chosen by entering into a covenant with God. Second, because it exists to serve God, not to master others. A master race worships itself. A chosen people worships something beyond itself. A master race values power. A chosen people cares for the powerless. The most repeated commandment in the Torah is repeated 36 times, is you've got to take care of the powerless in society. A master race believes it has rights. A chosen people knows that it only has responsibilities. The key virtues of a master race are pride, honor, and fame. The key virtue of a chosen people is humility. A master race produces monumental buildings, triumphal inscriptions, and a literature of self-congratulation. Israel, to a degree unique in history, produces a literature of almost uninterrupted self-criticism. One of the things that gives us some confidence in the Bible's account of history is how poorly it understands the lot of Israel and the Jews. Peoples generally don't write histories that are self-critical. Most histories, particularly in ancient times, are written to glorify the writing culture. This addresses the question Bryce raises, and again, I just think this is brilliant. Never say, I hate, I kill, because my religion says so. Every text needs interpretation. Every interpretation needs wisdom. Every wisdom needs careful negotiation between the timeless and time. Fundamentalism reads texts as if God were as simple as we are. This is unlikely to be true.
Beautiful.
One of the aspects of religious fundamentalism is to say, this is what the text is. I'm sorry, but I have to kill you. Particularly in the Protestant world, there is this idea of sola scriptura. Don't interpret the text for me. Just give me my Bible, and I will read it, and I will interpret it. Big problem, number one, is they're reading it probably in English, at least in this country, rather than in Hebrew and Greek, Greek for the New Testament. But the second is the great religions, I would certainly say Judaism and Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, and I would say even Islam, has a tradition of relying on scholars to help us understand what the text means, understanding it both in time, when it was written, and what timeless values are incorporated in the text. along the same lines, and even on the next page, every text-based religion develops its own traditions of interpretation. The rabbis in the Talmud say one who translates a verse literally is a liar. If you translate simply and literally, you are lying because you're really denying investigation into multiple levels of depth and interpretation. Anyone who's been involved in Torah study knows, boy, when we start struggling with text, we might spend, 2 hours on one phrase, maybe on one word. When I taught the class on Kabbalah, I pointed out I have a book, an entire book on the meaning of the word echad in the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai echad. What does that word mean? I have a book with 25 essays on what that one word means. And his bottom line, which I very much agree with, is we need to recover the absolute values that make Abrahamic monotheism, that's a code word for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the humanizing force it has been at its best, the sanctity of life, the dignity of the individual, the twin imperative of justice and compassion, the moral responsibility of the rich for the poor, the commands to love the neighbor and the stranger, the insistence on peaceful modes of conflict resolution, and respectful listening to the other side of a case, forgiving the injuries of the past and focusing instead on building a future in which the children of the world of all colors, faith, and races can live together in grace and peace. I couldn't say it better myself, so I didn't even try. My bottom lines are, human evil is the result of our inherent nature to want things that aren't ours or necessarily ours, or we may have rights to them, we may not have rights to them, but boy, I sure want that. And our free will. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who's a Holocaust theologian, once addressed the question, it is an awesome and an off-filled, which is to say an off-full question, which is, if God was trying to teach us something in the Holocaust, what might that be? And his answer is, no matter how horrible we get, God will not intervene. I think the way he put it, he said, there is no more eloquent testimony than the unchallenged, than the murder, let me leave out the word unchallenged, than the murder of 1.5 million innocent children without God intervening to testify to that. Erwin, I'll call on you in a minute.
Okay.
Religion is not perfect, but I believe it's our best hope, mainly because nothing else seems to work. And specifically, cultures like Nazi Germany and communism, which are formed on their own ethical systems, but not based on the idea that human life is sacred, seem to rise to levels of murder that are incomprehensible. Humans, by our nature, can and often do misuse religion. I always reference this idea of walking down a dark alley. You're walking down the proverbial dark alley in a bad part of town, and you see a bunch of big guys walking toward you. And then all of a sudden they walk under a light, and you realize that they're being led by a Catholic or a Christian clergyman with a clerical collar, and they're all holding Bibles. Do you feel more or less afraid if you see that? And somebody once said, well, if I was in, Spain in the 11th century or the 12th century, I would be more afraid. But I certainly would feel much better knowing that. So which religions are okay? Which religions are kosher? I'm so glad you asked. I will jump into that in a moment. But first, Erwin.
Yeah, I would like to know if you were less afraid when our president held up the Bible yesterday.
No, that's a great comeback. If he had a priest with him and they were studying it, I would go back to my ophthalmologist and say, the lenses you planted in me for cataracts are clearly no. It's a great point. But the question is, do you think Trump takes anything in the Bible seriously?
No.
He doesn't take anything seriously except his own power.
Oh, I think he takes a lot seriously. I think,
Yes, he does.
you can almost go back. I mean, I would say, I hate to make it political, but you can go back to, whoops, click here, click there, click there.
Yeah. The last paragraph.
Dignity of the individual, imperative of justice and compassion, moral responsibility of the rich for the poor, the command to love the neighbor and the stranger, insistence on peaceful modes of conflict resolution, respectful listening to the other side of the case, forgiving the injuries of the past and focusing instead on building of the future in which the children of the world, all colors, faces, can live together in peace. If I wish I had a president that I believe espoused those ideals. Any other comments? I do want to make a comment on what the best religion is and what's a kosher religion. Whoops. Just close this. Any other comments? Okay, let me move toward that. I don't see any hands up. Okay, so I've shown this a lot. So forgive me if you've seen this before. It's the parable of the blind and the elephant. And it's in a Jainist and Hindu tradition. So imagine a bunch of blind people examining an elephant, and they come up with very different understandings of the nature of an elephant. You know, this one thinks it's a spear by the tusk. The one by the trunk thinks it's a snake. This lady thinks it's a tree. This guy thinks it's a wall. This person thinks it's like a rope. So which one of them are speaking truth?
All of them.
All of them are speaking truth, but it's impossible because their description of this one thing is utterly inconsistent. So of course, my point is, in terms of different religions asserting to understand the nature of God, perhaps we can each in our various religions only see and understand a portion of God's totality. The error is in our certainty that our view is the only truth. And then my addition to this idea is the elephant sounds, and everybody hears the same sound. And so my thesis on this is the sound they all hear is the golden rule. The idea that human life is sacred and you should do to others what you would like them to do to you. If you Google golden rule, there's something called the Golden Rule Project responsible for this poster, and something like 200 faith traditions understanding of the golden rule. So I am going to, I'll just show this slide and then I'll call on Bryce. Next week, tragedy, a much more difficult problem. I hope to see you then. And Bryce.
So I think one of the things that we're up against is that a religion is not always used for its own sake and for the altruistic reasons that it claims for itself.
I agree.
Okay, and that sometimes religion is used for political purposes and for personal gain. And how would you expect most people to be able to parse whether their religion is truly good or is good being manipulated towards evil?
I don't have an easy answer to that, but I guess the question is, would it lead to the values that were mentioned by Rabbi Sachs? The thing that I observe is, if you take communism, for example, it has a value. The value of communism is the state should own everything and should distribute to people on an equal basis the good things in life. And if people get in the way of that system, you should just murder them because they are just means of production. They're like boll weevils, they're like an infestation because there's no mention in that system of the sanctity of life. So the only thing I would say for religion is at least it starts by asserting these values and then goes astray for many reasons. One, we do still have the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, and I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but there are religious leaders who just are in it for the money, for self-aggrandizement. I want you to hold your hands up to the computer screen and send me $25 and I will heal you, tonight.
Well, God wants me to have my own satellite.
Exactly. So religion is bad enough, but at least it espouses the right things. And I also think fundamentalism and thinking you've got a lock on all the secrets is a huge problem. And other than asserting that it's a problem, I honestly don't know how to deal with that. Erwin.
Yeah, I heard Rabbi Sachs speak in a convention, and I know that he was very much involved with the Rebbe.
Mhm.
And I think the last paragraph, what you read, it's not. It doesn't sound like him. It's not realistic.
Well, he's asserting values. So values and objectives aren't necessarily describing reality. But I can tell you it was him. I typed it right out of his book this afternoon.
Yeah, I know, but
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, he's asserting, hatikva, the hope
Yeah.
of what religions should be.
Utopia.
What he's really saying is the Abrahamic religions should ascribe back to those goals. There's actually, whoops, let me just see if I go backwards. Whoops. I want to see what page that was on. 263.
200 and something.
Yeah, 263.
Yeah.
How do I get back to you guys? He actually goes on. I didn't just want to fill. Oh, wrong book. Anyway, he goes on to say, we can do this, but it's not easy. I mean, I don't think he thinks that if everybody just signs on the dotted line, all these problems will go away. But I think what he's asserting is at least the Abrahamic religions have these goals and stated objectives. And now the challenge is for us to live up to our stated goals and objectives.
So if Cheryl will cure everybody, she will be the happiest person, but she's gonna be broke. So is that realistic?
Is Mother Teresa realistic? Are people that go, Catholic nuns that go live among lepers and are willing to impoverish themselves to help their fellows, do you believe that happens?
No.
You don't believe that happens?
Erwin.
Happens all the time.
Mother Teresa never cured anybody.
Her goal was.
You don't know that.
You don't know that, but I mean, she was delivering medication and medicine.
But some of the words that she used might have helped people to feel like they were empowered to heal themselves.
Yeah, and curing is not healing.
Part of healing is goes on in your own head.
But there are people who sacrifice their financial well-being and their physical well-being to help other people.
That's correct.
And I would say many of those people, not all of them, but many of them are motivated by their religion, and I would say by religious ideas, and not simply.
So the great Rabbi Yossel, do you think he cured the blind?
I don't know. Are you talking about Jesus?
Yeah, I call him Yossel.
Yeah, it's not my testament. Do you think Moses parted the sea?
Yeah.
Do you think Elijah and Elisha raised people from the dead?
No.
No, it's in the Bible.
Yeah. And
right?
I know God wrote the Bible, so
I'm sorry? So do you believe Elijah the prophet and Elisha the prophet raised people from the dead?
No.
Okay. So there are parts of our Bible you don't believe, and clearly you don't necessarily have to believe the New Testament. Any other questions, comments, or alternative sermons?
I have a question. Michael, you said that
I've got tons of them.
Yes.
Michael, you said that 70%. I think you were saying that 70% of charities are donated by people that are religious. Is that right?
That was, I found that statistic somewhere, that 70%, yes, of charitable giving in the United States are supplied by religious people.
So we talked about how religious people are generally more charitable and have
Yes.
stronger values and stand for something. So as a Jew, it's important to be someone that stands up for, to relate it to what's going on today, for Black Lives Matter, because humanity is created in God's sanctity. Is that right? Well, I
God's
don't remember
image.
the wording, but
Yeah.
humanity is sacred.
So
Image, in God's image.
a basic teaching is all of humanity are created in God's image. And so
Okay.
humans matter.
Humans matter. So so that means that if there were more Jews, then in theory there should be more people that are standing up for minorities. There's more people that would be doing good in the world.
No,
So
because those are no.
is-
Okay, I don't agree with your premise, because Christians and Muslims are also taught that everyone is created in the image of God.
Okay.
It shouldn't matter whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. And I don't know what the religious imperatives behind Hinduism and other religions are.
So people should just be religious because it would make them better people.
Yes, and I would say by religious, I would mean any religion that ascribes to the fundamental principle of the golden rule, which is human life is sacred and you should treat others the way you want to be treated. And as Hillel said, the rest is commentary, go and study.
Yes.
And that's what differentiates us from communist and
in communism,
cultures like
Nazism.
Nazi Germany.
Yeah, because in those cultures,
Nazism.
human life was not sacred.
No.
Yeah, that's the difference.
That is an important difference. Okay, so thank you all.
Thank you.
For coming, and
thank you, Michael.
Boy,
Thank you,
let us,
Michael.
I never thought that this would be such an immediately significant subject when I chose it for the first session. Next week is a much more difficult subject, which is how do we understand natural tragedy, which would be COVID, good old-fashioned plague, cancer, in my own family, Huntington's disease, earthquakes. I understand there was an earthquake this evening, although I didn't feel it. I think so. Anyway, how do we understand that? Does God get involved in that? So that's a much more difficult question, theologically speaking. And I am going to just take a quick look at the chat.